So I'm going to talk about Flash for a while. I don't know if you are aware of it, but about a month ago, Adobe, which is the company behind Flash, they announced that in 2020, Flash is going to be officially deprecated. But this is nothing new. I mean, Flash is already disabled by default in all major browsers today, which effectively makes it dead, right? So I'll take you in a story of what happened with Flash from its early days until when it rose to control the entire web and eventually died. So my name is Omri, and like Maria mentioned, I spent over 5 years doing Flash development, which at this stage is the equivalent of having a master's degree in ancient Latin or something like that. So let's see. If you noticed, I'm doing some Game of Thrones slides theme here, and this is because the story of Flash, much like Game of Thrones, is a story of ego and violent wars and some romance and perhaps some nudity at the end. I can't promise. But let's start with the old ages, all right? This is a story in chapters. So by raise of hands, who remembers what the internet was like in 1999? Okay, we have some veterans in the crowd. So I'll tell you what it was like in my point of view. And I still remember because in 1999, I was a 14-year-old girlish looking boy with braces on my teeth. And what I would do on the internet is that every day I would wait to 10 o'clock at night because at that time it was affordable to surf on the internet. It was riding on phone company phone calls, which was expensive. So everybody would actually log in at 10 p.m. and we would use MIRC, which was a popular chat software, which was like Facebook of that time. And what else? We would download MP3 files to play on Winamp. Everybody, smiles. Look at the playlist, which was like Spotify of that time. And let's take a closer look at what the web pages were like in 1999. This is like the standard website of that days. I actually had my own Seinfeld website hosted on GeoCities. And as you can expect, it included many animated GIFs, and it even had a MIDI background playing. And this was like standard web, right? This was state-of-the-art for that days. So I remember in 1999 that one day I accidentally stumbled upon a website. It was a website, a portfolio of a Belgian studio, and they demonstrated their capabilities in building amazing websites. And I could trace that website for you. So let me show you what Flash was like in 1999. Are you ready?
Welcome to energy.be.
Wow. So nice. It's vector graphics, so I can even zoom in and it still scales nicely. It has sound. It has like flying spaceships. Let's see the graphics section. Wait for it.
Graphics.
Amazing. And we can even go back. So this is, I must say that even for today, I'm doing front-end development in recent technologies. And today, if you would ask me to build a website like this, it's kind of a stressful demand for me. And in Flash, this was state-of-the-art Flash. This site won Best Site of the Year from 1998. But I can imagine how I would build this in Flash, and I cannot imagine, honestly, how would I build this in recent JavaScript, HTML, CSS, whatever. So back to the story. in order to understand why Flash was so unique, we need to take a closer look at what others were doing at that time. So, in that time, the web was torn in a vicious war between two browsers. And they were, two sides were, on the left, a kind of a fat king, but lovable, and it was called Netscape by House Mozilla. And on the other side, cruel, rich, the king that everybody hated, Internet Explorer from House Microsoft. And those two kings were fighting over control of the kingdom of the web. And I guess Netscape was the first one to realize that in order to gain more control of the web, they need to bring interactivity into web pages. What interactivity means in this sense is that users would be able to click on the page and interact with it instantaneously, instead of waiting for a full response from the backend. And in order to achieve this, they gave one of their engineers a whole week to think about the problem, and he came up with JavaScript. Pretty good for 1 week. Microsoft quickly responded. They copied this scripting language, and in order to avoid being sued, they named it JScript. Okay, so now we have two scripting languages, but these two kings were grown up enough, and they were big boys, and they understood that it's not feasible to demand developers to deal with two different scripting languages. So they took their smartest engineers and sent them over to Switzerland, home of the European Computer Manufacturers Association, crappy name, and they asked them to write a standard specification for the language. And they fought a lot, and they had some disagreements, but eventually they could compromise and agree on the spec for the language. But what they could not agree on is the name of the language. Would it be JavaScript or JScript? So they took a shitty compromise and named it after the association, ECMA, and they named it ECMAScript. So this is the story of how JavaScript became to be known as ECMAScript. So situation was a bit better for developers. Now they had the standard scripting language, but they were still struggling in writing HTML and CSS that would look the same in all browsers. That's because the two different browsers, the two dominant browsers, had different rendering engines. So life was shitty in that sense, and I guess even today it's kind of shitty, right? To write a website that looks the same. And it was around that time that a new kid started gaining attention. A new star was rising, and he was a rebel. And the reason I'm saying he was a rebel, his name was Flash, by the way. And the reason I'm saying he was a rebel is because Flash did not care about standards of the web. They couldn't care less if they write standard HTML or CSS or JavaScript in order to gain cross-browser looking websites, and that's because they offered a new way of thinking. The way of thinking was this. As a website creator, you would download Flash. It was a desktop software, and you could use it to export SWF files, and then these files would play the same in all browsers, and this was made possible by installing a plugin in the website. So this is the experience users would get. They would install the plugin, and in this red box that you see, the content was rendered by the plugin. So it was possible to make a promise that once you design it, it would look pixel perfect across all browsers. And with an added bonus that you can easily animate things in Flash. So let's see how easy it was to animate stuff in Flash. Okay, I see that my virtual machine just died, so let me quickly start it. A quick story now is that I'm running a virtual machine for Windows because my copy of Flash has expired. The trial has expired, so I had to install a Windows machine so I can start a new trial. So now you can all witness that I did not purchase it. So this is the software I mentioned, the authoring tool, which is, by the way, the source of income for Adobe. This software would cost a lot. Okay, so we have Flash. It kind of looks like a Photoshop for animators. Yes, it's try. I want to continue. And let's look at how easy it is in Flash to animate this amazing horse. So what I want this horse to do is to pop into the screen, and this is why I'm going to set its starting position outside the screen, and I want it to bounce in, so do a small bounce movement, and then I want this horse to pose for a picture, so I'm going to tilt it, and I'm going to set a brightness effect here. And what's nice about Flash is that I can ask Flash to automatically animate these transitions for me, and I can even control the tweening, which is like the acceleration. And with these few clicks, I can have an amazing horse smiling to the camera. Quite nice. Thank you. Okay, we'll get back to the horse. Back to the slides. Right. So you've all seen animations, and you might think that the need to install a plugin brought a barrier on users, but the reality was that 97% of users of that time had the Flash plugin installed, which was great if you want to achieve control of the web. So effectively, Flash conquered the kingdom of animation, which was nice. But they also understood that in order to bring more users, they needed to bring interactivity into the pages. So they did a shameless move, and they wrote a scripting language for Flash. And if you did some front-end development recently, you might think this is JavaScript, but it's not. Actually, it's something called ActionScript. And the reason it's similar is that Adobe shamelessly took the specification of ECMAScript and wrote a dialect of it called ActionScript. I'm saying shameless because they did not participate in the efforts of standardizing the web. They did the opposite. They forked the web. But they took the scripting language because they liked it, and they assumed that developers who were familiar with JavaScript would be easily onboarded into the new platform. So let's see how easy it was to script in Flash. So, same horse, but this time interactive. So what I have here is a little repeated animations in an inner component for the horse, and I'll show you some script. Can you read this? Okay, so let's briefly go over it. I'm registering a lifecycle event called enterFrame, which is the equivalent of executing a script on an interval. And this script checks the position of the mouse on each interval. It's like executed 25 times per second. And if the position of the mouse is to the left, it's going to flip the horse and make it play. And otherwise, it's going to turn it to the other direction and stop. So with these few lines of script, if my mouse is to the right, he holds still, and to the left, he nods. So again, take an exercise in your mind if you're a developer, and think about what it takes today to build this thing with standard web technologies. It's not that easy. It will take some time, and this is like, it took me 10 minutes actually building this. So now Flash could dominate more kingdoms of the web. It could control the advertising industry because they used it to build interactive banners and landing pages, and they also controlled the widget kingdom, which was like small games. And ActionScript was nice enough to provide for these things. But around that time, it was around 2004 or 5, the web was transitioning. The term web 2.0 was coined, referring to the transition of how people use the web in order to generate more user-generated content. And the advantage in infrastructures of the internet of better speed allowed people to spend much more time online. And the engineers of Adobe understood that this Photoshop for animators is not strong enough for these needs. And it meant that they needed to get serious. Get serious in bringing real developers to use Flash and giving them tools to use it better. So what they did in 2005, I think, they released a bunch of tools and APIs to make it a more standard piece of software. And the three main points were a real development environment. This time it was an Eclipse-based environment that users could use like they would use to write Java. And they had like standard debugging capabilities now. And the second thing they did is to write a new version of the ActionScript scripting language. And what was special about it is that it was statically typed, so you could get compile time errors, which kind of resembles the phase that JavaScript is going today with the introduction of Flow and Typescript. I mean, developers want to get a much more predictable development experience. Second thing they did is that they understood that developers cannot not really continue drawing these movie clips on the Flash IDE, and they introduced declarative syntax for building Flash components. Take a look at this. Declarative UI with bindings to ActionScript. So this should, at this stage, ring some bells. This looks kind of like React of our time with bindings to JavaScript. So this was nice, but the key feature that they released in 2005 was a killer set of APIs around rendering graphics, video, and doing network communications. And again, free from the need to be compliant with other browsers, it allowed Flash to move fast and not care about the support that browsers would implement. All users had to do is install the Flash plugin. And I guess this sounds a bit hand-wavy, but let me show you which websites used Flash at that time. So, websites like games like Farmville had to use Flash in order to bring nice animations and to coordinate the communication between all the users who would use this game. Another famous example is Google Maps. They used Flash to load their maps in a smart way and to render their street view, which required 3D capabilities. That was only possible if you want to target all the browsers. It was only made possible using Flash. And I guess the most famous example of that time is YouTube. YouTube relied on Flash to play video on all devices, which was, I guess, non-existent in HTML5 of that time. So now it meant that Flash had dominant control of many parts of the web, which was amazing. This was the peak of Flash around 2006. But around that time, something happened. Vicious Queen was planning her glorious comeback, and she brought 3 dragons with her. Can you guess who I'm talking about? Yes. So, Steve Jobs introduced his 3 dragons to the world. It was an iPod, a phone, and a groundbreaking internet communications device, all in one device. So Steve actually revealed that the world that we know is much larger. If the desktop world was one continent, now he discovered a completely new continent called mobile. And this is, I guess, where the analogy to Khalisi ends, because Steve was no breaker of chains, right? Steve Jobs was described by many people as a control freak, as a terrifying bully, and he had complicated relationships with Adobe. I guess in the early days, both Adobe and Apple targeted same kind of people. They targeted people who like nice design, beautiful typography. But something happened along the years, and Steve actually told Adobe to bend the knee to Apple. And the way he did that is that in 2010, he published a blog post titled Thoughts on Flash, in which he explained why Flash would never be supported on any Apple mobile device. And here are the reasons he presented. So first of all, Flash is a closed platform. The tools around Flash are only released by Adobe, which means they have control of the features and the pricing, and nobody can interfere with that. Do you know another company who acts like this? All right, so Steve had a sense of humor, but he was right in that sense. Second reason is that Flash suffered for performance issues on mobile and security issues, which was true. Adobe did not attend in time to these issues. But the most important reason why you would never support Flash is that Adobe wanted developers to use Flash as a cross-device tool to write applications, which meant that unless all vendors of mobile devices adopted the same kind of features, then if the majority of developers would use Flash as a tool, it would essentially prevent them from adopting the latest features from Apple. If Apple releases, I don't know, a face recognition something, then Flash would not support that until all mobile devices vendors would support it. And essentially, Steve did not want any middleman between the APIs that he offered developers and the experience that users would eventually get. And he concluded the post with these words: perhaps Adobe should focus more on creating great HTML5 tools for the future and less on criticizing Apple for leaving the past behind. And this thing actually made Adobe stop adding new features to Flash and focus on making Flash convert existing content into these new technologies, mainly CSS and HTML5, and also made possible to compile some Flash applications to native mobile applications. But what that meant is that they stopped advancing, and they allowed the browsers to close the gap of features. And if you want to hear some buzzwords, then APIs like Fetch API, Canvas API, SVG, media source extensions, these are all HTML5 capabilities that were like kind of copied from Flash in order to get to feature parity with what Flash allowed. And it took a long time. It took around 5 years to close that gap, but eventually they succeeded. So in 2015, only 2 years back, YouTube finally ditched their Flash player and moved to a standard HTML5 player. And 1 year later, all browsers disabled Flash by default, effectively making Flash dead. So what can we learn from this story of how Flash rose and how it died? First of all, we've seen that the spirit of Flash carries on to other technologies. I mean, the good parts in Flash, we can see them in recent technologies. I showed you some resemblance to AJAX and to Flow and Typescript. And let me show you another library for React developed by Dotan from the Tel Aviv office, which allows you to orchestrate animations in React. And the way it does it is by expressing the source frame and the target frame, and this library magically animates the transitions between them, much like I showed you on how to animate content in the Flash software. So, second conclusion is that technology will die. I guess what I'm saying is that we are all small soldiers in big wars between giants. And if you're now invested in some particular technology by one of these giants, be aware that this technology might die and keep on learning. I mean, I know some Flash developers who did not adapt to this change and kept complaining around 5 years later that somebody moved their cheese. And I know some other Flash developers who made the transition to JavaScript, and they are happy developers today. So my message to you is keep on learning. And I guess the most important lesson from this story is that open standards win. Eventually, they win. It takes some time, but if the major vendors support open standards, they will take down any proprietary solution. And one interesting example for Klarna is something that I stumbled upon last week. I mean, we all know that Klarna checkout is a smooth experience, right? It's proprietary to Klarna. It's much more smooth than any other experience, but it requires you to integrate with Klarna. And what I'm showing you now is a new standard in HTML5 called Payments API, or Payment Request API. And this brings smooth checkout as a standard on all browsers, on all devices, natively. So let's see what happens if I add something to the cart and I go to the checkout. This is a native pop-up by Google, latest Google Chrome. You can try this on your browser, that offers me to pre-fill my address, knows my payment method, and basically allows me to pay with one click. So this kind of relates to what David Falk was speaking about an hour back, about how Klarna can offer some of its services without the full bundle. So you can rest assured Klarna is cooperating with this initiative. It has a representative on the committee that is designing this specification. But I guess what it means for us as Klarna is that we can no longer rely on proprietary things like Klarna checkout in a world where open standards exist. This will eventually be available on all browsers, on all devices, effectively making the Klarna checkout deprecated or useless. So with this sad tone, I thank you.